The clinking of glasses and the boisterous laughter of a party she wasn't invited to echoed through what used to be her sanctuary. Eleanor sat on the worn armchair in the corner of her own living room, a ghost in her own home. Her son, Michael, radiant and oblivious, toasted his new wife, Sarah, their smiles blindingly bright under the chandeliers Eleanor had painstakingly polished for decades. Sarah, draped in silk, gestured expansively as she recounted anecdotes, her voice cutting through the celebratory din. Each peal of laughter, each clink of champagne flutes was a fresh wound, a reminder of her invisibility. She watched, a silent observer, as platters of exotic cheeses and cured meats circulated, offerings from a life that had systematically excluded her. Her gaze drifted to the framed photographs on the mantelpiece. A faded image of Michael as a boy, gap-toothed and grinning, another of her late husband, Thomas, his arm around her, their faces etched with the promise of a shared future. Now those memories felt like relics from a forgotten era, overshadowed by the vibrant, audacious present unfolding around her. Her hands, gnarled with age and years of selfless service, trembled slightly as she rose, the unspoken urge to escape the suffocating joviality pushing her towards the kitchen. She found solace in the mundane, the rhythmic swish of soapy water against porcelain, the comforting weight of a damp sponge in her hand. The aroma of stale champagne and unfamiliar perfumes clung to the air, a stark contrast to the familiar scent of lavender and old books that once defined her home. As she meticulously scrubbed a champagne flute, its rim still sticky from a celebratory toast, fragments of conversation drifted in from the living room, sharp and clear above the din. "Just simplifies everything, darling." Sarah's voice, smooth as polished marble, sliced through the air. "With her name off the deed, there'll be no complications. And the will, of course, needed to be updated. It's all legally sound now, Michael." Eleanor's grip tightened on the glass, her knuckles turning white. Michael's reply was a low murmur, a hesitant agreement that was quickly swallowed by Sarah's confident pronouncements. "It's practical, dearest. Think of the future, our future." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, a declaration of war disguised as practicalities. Her name, removed, from the deed, from the will. The glass slipped from her grasp, clattering into the sink, the sound lost amidst the joyous cacophony. A cold dread seeped into her bones, chilling her to the core. How had it come to this? How had the son she nurtured, the home she built brick by brick, with love and sacrifice, become the stage for her utter erasure? The question echoed in the hollow chambers of her heart, a mournful, silent cry against the backdrop of their unbridled celebration. The scent of dust motes dancing in sunbeams always brought her back to those early days, to the quiet, aching emptiness after Thomas was gone. Eleanor remembered the crushing weight of grief, quickly superseded by the fierce, unyielding resolve to be everything for Michael. He was just 5 when his father's sudden illness stole him away, leaving Eleanor with a house that felt too big and a child who was too small to understand. But there was no time for wallowing. The bills didn't stop, and Michael needed a future. She found herself working 2 jobs. Mornings at the local bakery, the comforting scent of yeast and sugar, a stark contrast to the sterile quiet of the hospital where she spent her afternoons as a medical transcriptionist. There were days she'd skip lunch, the gnawing hunger a small price to pay if it meant a new pair of shoes for Michael, or that particular textbook he needed for school. Once, she even sold her grandmother's pearl necklace, a treasured heirloom, to cover a sudden tuition increase for a summer program he desperately wanted. Each sacrifice was a stitch in the fabric of his life, a thread pulled from her own to weave his tapestry. He was her identity, her purpose, her entire world. Every decision, every waking moment was filtered through the lens of Michael's well-being. She remembered the frantic weeks leading up to his high school prom, how she'd painstakingly learned to sew, pricking her fingers countless times just to craft the perfect suit for him. The proud gleam in his eyes when he tried it on, the way he straightened his shoulders, was more rewarding than any designer gown she could have bought for herself. Then there was the time he called from college, panicked, having forgotten his crucial medication before a big exam. Without a second thought, she'd packed a small bag, jumped in her old sedan, and driven through the night, the darkness of the highway illuminated only by her headlights and the burning desire to alleviate his distress. She arrived at dawn, exhausted but triumphant, to find him waiting, his relief a balm to her weary soul. Years blurred into a montage of unwavering devotion. When he spoke of his dream to start his own tech company, his eyes alight with youthful ambition, she listened, her heart swelling with pride. He needed seed money, a significant amount that stretched beyond her modest savings. Without hesitation, she met with the bank, the cold efficiency of the loan officer a stark contrast to the warmth of her own conviction. She remortgaged the Eviction house, the very home she had built with Thomas, the place steeped in their shared history. It was a calculated risk, one she took willingly, knowing that his success would be her greatest legacy. She saw it as an investment, not just in his company, but in his happiness, in his future. Through it all, a deep, weary love settled in her bones. She wasn't just his mother, she was his rock, his confidant, his silent supporter. She had watched him grow from a curious boy into a driven man, pouring every ounce of her being into nurturing his dreams. There was pride, an immense, overflowing pride in the man he had become, but also a quiet exhaustion that hummed beneath the surface. The sacrifices had been immense, the path often solitary, but she had always believed it was worth it. Every single moment, every skipped meal, every late night, every penny had been for him. He was her everything, and she had given him everything. The air in the house had become thick with an unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement of Eleanor's diminished presence. She tried to ignore it, to busy herself with small tasks, but the gnawing unease persisted. Then came the letter, tucked discreetly amidst the usual junk mail and utility bills. Its official seal and crisp, formal typeface sent a shiver down her spine even before she opened it. Inside, the legalese swam before her eyes, but the core message was devastatingly clear. The ownership of her beloved home, the very bricks and mortar she had poured her life into, had been quietly, meticulously transferred solely into Michael and Sarah's names. There was no mention of her, no acknowledgement of her decades of ownership, her sacrifices. It was as if she had never existed. Her hands trembled, the paper rustling like dry leaves. This wasn't just about property. It was about erasure, about being systematically removed from her own life. A cold, hard knot formed in her stomach. She had to confront him. She found Michael in the living room, engrossed in his phone, Sarah beside him, their heads close in whispered conversation. Eleanor held up the document, her voice shaking but resolute. "Michael," she began, the name catching in her throat. "What is this?" He looked up, a flicker of something unreadable, annoyance, guilt, crossing his face before settling into a practiced placidity. Sarah merely raised an eyebrow, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on her lips. Michael sighed, a theatrical exhalation of breath. "Mother, we've been meaning to talk to you about this. It's just a practical matter." He gestured vaguely at the document. "You're getting older, you know. Managing property, finances. It can be quite a burden." The words hit her like a physical blow. Too old to manage property? This house was an extension of her very being, a repository of every memory, every struggle, every triumph. "A burden?" she echoed, her voice rising, edged with a disbelief that bordered on hysteria. "This is my home, Michael. I remortgaged it. For your business. I sacrificed everything for this house. For you." He held up a calming hand, a gesture that only infuriated her further. "Now don't get emotional, Mother. It's for your own good. We're just protecting your interests, making sure everything is handled properly. Think of it as us taking care of you." Sarah nodded in agreement, her gaze unwavering, almost challenging. The condescension in his voice, the dismissal of her lifetime of effort, was a fresh wave of humiliation. She felt her face flush, tears pricking at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now. The next insult came swiftly. That very evening, as dusk settled, Michael approached her, a key dangling from his fingers. "Mother," he said, his tone overly solicitous, "we've decided it would be best if you used the guest room from now on. For your safety, of course. It has a lock, you see. You'll feel much more secure." The guest room, the room she had meticulously decorated for visiting friends, now to be her prison. The lock not for her safety, but to ensure her containment, her isolation. It was a stark declaration. She was no longer mistress of her own home, merely a guest, a burden to be managed. The following week, another envelope arrived. This time it wasn't just a letter, it was legal notice. A formal document, thick with official stamps and signatures, stating unequivocally that she was no longer a stakeholder in the estate. The legal jargon stripped away any lingering hope, any doubt. She was cut off, abandoned, voiceless. The paper felt cold and heavy in her hands, a final, brutal confirmation of her complete dispossession. She stood in the hallway, the vibrant life of her son and daughter-in-law echoing from the living room, and felt a profound, chilling emptiness. Stunned, abandoned, voiceless. These words barely scratched the surface of the desolation that settled over her. The breaking point had been reached, and now the ground beneath her feet had crumbled away entirely. The days began to bleed into one another, marked only by the escalating silence. Her 75th birthday arrived, not with the usual flurry of cards and phone calls, but with a chilling, profound quiet. No cheerful, "Happy birthday, Mum," from Michael, no excited chatter from Sarah. The phone, once a lifeline to the world, remained stubbornly inert on the charger. Friends, once regular visitors for afternoon tea and lively conversations, stopped coming. At first, she'd wonder, then worry, then call, only to be met with polite, distant answers, or worse, no answer at all. One afternoon, she finally managed to get through to Carol, her oldest friend, whose voice was tinged with an uncomfortable awkwardness. "Oh, Eleanor, dear, Michael told me you weren't feeling well, that you needed your rest. We didn't want to disturb you." The lie hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Michael had created a narrative, a protective cordon around her, effectively branding her an invalid, too frail for company. The digital world, too, began to vanish. She'd tried to log into her social media, a small window to the lives of distant relatives and former colleagues, only to find her accounts inaccessible. When she cautiously broached the subject with Michael, he'd given her that same placid, concerned look. "Mother, we've had to delete those accounts for your protection. The internet can be a very dangerous place, full of scams and unscrupulous people. We just don't want you getting exploited." Her protests were met with a firm, paternalistic dismissal. He had sealed off her digital connections, leaving her adrift in a sea of analog silence. The vibrant tapestry of her external life was systematically unraveled, thread by thread, leaving her isolated within the very walls that once offered comfort. But the cruelest cut was yet to come. One morning, she attempted to withdraw a small amount of cash from her account for groceries, only to have her card declined. Puzzled, then alarmed, she tried again, then called the bank, her voice laced with growing panic. The automated message informed her that her access was frozen, citing unusual activity. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't unusual activity. This was deliberate. She confronted Michael, her voice a fragile whisper of desperation. He looked up from his breakfast, a piece of toast suspended midair. "Oh yes, Mother, we handled that. It's for your financial security. We're managing everything now. Less for you to worry about." He said it so casually, as if discussing the weather. Her own money, the fruit of decades of labor and sacrifice, was now beyond her reach, controlled by the very son she had given everything to. The shame of having to ask him for every small expense was a constant burning ember in her gut. She, who had always been fiercely independent, was now utterly dependent, a prisoner in her own home, financially shackled. The silence grew louder, a roaring in her ears. One evening, unable to sleep, she padded softly towards the kitchen for a glass of water. As she neared Michael's study, she heard their voices, hushed but distinct. "The Pines, darling. It's highly rated," Sarah's voice, cool and clinical. "They have excellent nursing staff, and it's secure, of course." Michael responded, "Yes, but what about Mother? She can be difficult." Sarah chuckled, a low, almost contemptuous sound. "She'll adjust. It's for the best, Michael. You know it is. We can finally have our lives back." The words struck her like a physical blow, sending a cold dread through her veins that eclipsed all previous pain. The Pines. A care home. They were discussing her future, planning her removal, as if she were a piece of furniture to be relocated. Her world, which had been progressively shrinking, now threatened to disappear entirely. She stumbled back to the guest room, the lock on the door a mocking symbol of her imprisonment. The kettle, once a beacon of comfort and companionship, now whistled in an empty kitchen. Its shrill cry pierced the profound quiet, a stark reminder of her solitude. Every shared laugh, every whispered confidence, every familiar face had been systematically erased, leaving her in a vacuum of abandonment. Her world had indeed grown quieter, replaced by the deafening sound of her own isolation and the terrifying hum of their insidious plans. The isolation was a shroud, heavy and suffocating, yet beneath its oppressive weight a flicker of something stubborn began to stir. Confined to the guest room, stripped of her independence, Eleanor found herself sifting through the remnants of her past, a desperate attempt to grasp at anything familiar, anything that still felt like hers. Old photo, albums, faded letters, dusty trinkets, each item a bittersweet echo of a life that felt increasingly distant. It was during this somber archaeological dig, through an old, forgotten trunk in the back of the closet, that her fingers brushed against a thick, brittle envelope. Inside, nestled amongst Thomas's old war medals and dried flowers from their wedding, was a document. Yellowed with age, its creases sharp, it was an agreement, meticulously drafted and notarized, bearing the unmistakable signature of her late husband, Thomas, and her own. Her eyes, accustomed to the blurry despair of recent weeks, sharpened as she read the dense legal prose. It was an amendment to their original property deed, drafted shortly after they purchased the house, a testament to Thomas's foresight and his unwavering devotion. It clearly stated that in the event of his passing, Eleanor would retain an undeniable, protected partial ownership of the property, a clause designed to safeguard her against any future claims or unforeseen circumstances. Crucially, the document explicitly stated that this clause could never be legally voided without her direct, written, and notarized consent. Her consent, which she had never given. The paper, once flimsy with age, now felt like a shield, solid and unyielding in her trembling hands. A spark ignited within her, a tiny ember in the vast, cold expanse of her despair. This wasn't just old paperwork. This was a lifeline, a forgotten anchor in the storm of her son's betrayal. Thomas, even in death, had been looking out for her. He had understood, in a way Michael never could, the profound significance of this home to her. The legal glitch was real, concrete, and potentially her salvation. Michael and Sarah, in their meticulous planning, had overlooked this one critical detail, buried deep in the annals of time and a husband's enduring love. Her mind, dulled by weeks of desolation, began to whir with a new kind of energy. She needed help, real help, not sympathy, but expertise. And there was only one person who came to mind, a confidant from her youth, a sharp mind she had always admired, Patricia. Her childhood best friend, Patty, who had, serendipitously, gone on to become a highly respected paralegal before retiring a few years ago. She still remembered Patty's fierce sense of justice, her meticulous attention to detail. Finding Patty's number was another small triumph, buried in an old leather-bound address book. Dialing the number, her fingers, usually so unsteady, were firm. The conversation was brief, punctuated by gasps of shock from Patty, followed by a surge of indignant anger on her behalf. "Eleanor, my God, I can't believe this. That boy, after everything you did for him." But beneath the outrage was a core of professional resolve. Patty listened intently as Eleanor, her voice gaining strength with each word, explained the depth of the betrayal, the isolation, and finally, the astonishing discovery of the notarized agreement. Patty's response was immediate and decisive. "Don't you worry, my friend. This is a game changer. Meet me at my place tomorrow morning. Bring that document. We're going to pick through every single word." The shift was palpable, a tremor of defiance, running through her weary frame. The leaden weight of despair began to lift, replaced by a nascent, unfamiliar sensation: focus. She was not powerless, not entirely. The tears still came, but now they were tears of quiet resolve, not crushing defeat. Thomas had given her a weapon, a final act of protection, and Patty was ready to help her wield it. The game was far from over. The fight wouldn't be loud, wouldn't involve raised voices or tearful pleas. It would be a quiet, meticulous campaign, a strategic chess match where every move was carefully considered. Eleanor, guided by Patty's steady hand, began to gather evidence with a newfound determination. Every interaction with Michael and Sarah, every seemingly innocuous conversation was subtly recorded on a small, inconspicuous device Patty had provided. She documented the dates, times, and details of every instance of their control, their condescension, their blatant disregard for her rights. A timeline began to emerge, a stark record of their systematic takeover, a damning indictment of their betrayal. Patty, with her years of experience in the legal system, was invaluable. She helped Eleanor understand the nuances of the notarized agreement, the legal loopholes Michael and Sarah had exploited, and the steps needed to reclaim her rightful ownership. She stressed the importance of remaining calm, composed, and above all, meticulous. "This isn't about emotion, Eleanor," Patty would say, her voice firm but kind. "It's about facts, about the law, and the law is on your side." But Patty also understood that they couldn't fight this battle alone. They needed a legal powerhouse, someone who could navigate the complex legal landscape with ruthless efficiency. And that's when Eleanor remembered the small savings account, a secret stash she had quietly built over the years, a nest egg Michael and Sarah knew nothing about. It was enough to hire a lawyer, a discreet but formidable one, recommended by Patty, Ms. Evelyn Reed. Ms. Reed was known for her sharp intellect, her unwavering resolve, and her ability to dismantle even the most complex legal arguments. With Ms. Reed on board, the wheels of justice began to turn. A petition was filed, a meticulously crafted document outlining the history of the property, Eleanor's contributions, the notarized agreement, and the egregious actions of Michael and Sarah. The petition demanded that Eleanor's partial ownership be legally recognized and restored. Concurrently, Eleanor, with Patty's guidance, drafted a new will, a document that would ensure her wishes were honored, a final act of control over her own destiny. The court hearings began, stark and formal. Michael and Sarah, initially confident, even dismissive, were visibly shaken by the force of Ms. Reed's arguments, the weight of the evidence, and the unwavering presence of Eleanor herself. She attended every hearing, her face composed, her eyes clear and unwavering. She didn't raise her voice, didn't engage in emotional outbursts. She simply sat there, a silent testament to her resilience, her dignity, and her unwavering determination to reclaim what was rightfully hers. She watched as their carefully constructed facade began to crumble, their arrogance replaced by a growing unease. She didn't need to raise her voice to win. Her silence spoke volumes. The courtroom air was thick with anticipation as Eleanor, impeccably dressed and radiating a quiet strength, rose to deliver her statement. Her voice, clear and steady, filled the room, carrying the weight of decades of love, sacrifice, and ultimately, betrayal. She didn't shout or accuse. Instead, she laid bare the meticulous timeline of her life for Michael, his father's passing, her double shifts, the remortgaging of her home for his dreams, the gradual erosion of her autonomy, and finally, the shocking discovery of the deed transfer and the care home plans. She held up the notarized agreement, its historical significance a stark contrast to the modern-day machinations. Her narrative was compelling, delivered with a poise that belied the turmoil she had endured. Michael and Sarah, seated at their table, shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning fear as her words, backed by Ms. Reed's unassailable legal arguments, painted a devastating picture of their actions. When Eleanor finished, a hushed silence fell over the court. The judge, a stoic woman known for her rigorous adherence to the law, leaned forward, her expression unreadable. After a tense pause, she delivered her ruling. The words resonated with the sound of triumph. The notarized agreement was indeed valid and binding. Eleanor's partial ownership of the property was to be immediately reinstated, and due to the egregious nature of Michael and Sarah's attempts to dispossess her and the proven financial and emotional distress caused, they were ordered to vacate the property within 30 days. The judge's voice was firm, leaving no room for appeal or negotiation. Justice, in its most profound and poetic form, had arrived. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees, washed over Eleanor. She looked at Michael, his face now ashen, his previous arrogance replaced by a gaping horror. Sarah sat rigidly beside him, her perfectly composed demeanor shattered. They had underestimated her, had seen her as an old woman easily manipulated, easily discarded. But they were wrong, so terribly wrong. The greatest satisfaction came not from the court's decree, but from the personal delivery of the eviction notice. 30 days later, with the legal documents firmly in hand, Eleanor stood on her own porch, the familiar wood under her feet feeling solid and true once more. Michael opened the door, his eyes still holding a flicker of confusion, as if expecting her to be packing her bags, not holding papers. Eleanor extended the envelope, her hand steady. "Michael," she said, her voice devoid of anger, just a cool, unwavering resolve. "This is for you." He took the envelope, his brow furrowed, and pulled out the document. His eyes scanned the header, then the first few lines, before widening in dawning horror. "Eviction notice." He looked up, his jaw slack, a single muscle twitching in his temple. The disbelief on his face was absolute, a perfect reflection of the humiliation she had endured for months. He crumpled the paper slightly, his gaze darting from the notice to her, searching for an explanation, for a sign of the woman he thought he knew, the one he had so casually cast aside. Eleanor met his gaze, a faint, knowing smile gracing her lips. The air hummed with a quiet power. "You thought I was done?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a sharpened blade. "I was just silent." With that, she turned, stepping back into the warmth and light of her home, leaving him standing on the porch, a man dispossessed by his own avarice, holding the cold paper that sealed his fate. The house was hers again, and a profound, hard one. Peace settled over her. The aftermath was swift, a stark reversal of fortune. From her living room window, a quiet sentinel, Eleanor watched as Michael and Sarah's meticulously built world began to crumble. Boxes, once symbols of their aspirations, now filled the entryway, stark cardboard monuments to their unraveling. Dreams. She saw Sarah, her silk dresses replaced by practical jeans and a strained expression, directing movers with a frantic energy. Michael, usually so composed, looked disheveled, his shoulders slumped as he hauled heavier items. The laughter that had once filled her home was gone, replaced by the grating sounds of tape guns and the hollow thud of packed belongings. The once vibrant, audacious presence of their celebratory gatherings was reduced to the mundane, humiliating reality of an eviction. The calls started almost immediately after the eviction notice was served. Michael's number, Sarah's number, even numbers she didn't recognize, presumably from mutual acquaintances trying to mediate. Her phone, once silent for so long, now vibrated incessantly. Each incoming call was a desperate plea, a desperate attempt to claw back what they had so ruthlessly taken. She saw the messages too, a cascade of apologies, explanations, and thinly veiled attempts to negotiate. "Mother, please, let's talk," one read. "We made a mistake. We can fix this," another pleaded. Sarah's messages were more theatrical, filled with expressions of regret and sorrow. There were even flowers delivered to her doorstep, an opulent bouquet of white lilies, a stark contrast to the barren emotional landscape they had created. But Eleanor's response was unwavering, a wall of calculated silence. She watched the phone ring, the screen lighting up with their names, and simply let it ring. She didn't pick up. She didn't reply. Every number that called, every message that pinged, was met with a cold, unwavering block. The flowers were left on the porch until they wilted, then unceremoniously discarded. Letters arrived, thick with unspoken pleas and carefully crafted. Excuses, but they were returned to sender, every single one, unopened. Her resolve was absolute, forged in the crucible of their betrayal. There was no room for negotiation, no space for forgiveness. They had shown her who they truly were, and she had learned her lesson, a hard-won wisdom that left no room for sentimentality. Her tone, in this new chapter of her life, was one of composed detachment. The hurt was still there, a deep scar, but it no longer dictated her actions. She moved through her house, not with the hurried, furtive steps of a guest, but with the slow, deliberate pace of its rightful owner. Every room was hers again. She ran her hand along the polished wood of the dining table, where countless family meals had been shared, where they had celebrated his graduation, his first big promotion. She stood in the doorway of what had been her own bedroom, now reclaimed, no longer just a guest room with a lock. The memories, once painful echoes of loss, were now reclaiming their true meaning, bathed in the light of her renewed sovereignty. She walked into Michael's study, the room where she had overheard their chilling plans for her. The empty shelves, the faint outlines of their removed furniture, spoke volumes of their hasty departure. There was no joy in their downfall, only a profound sense of quiet satisfaction. She had taken back what was hers, not just the physical space, but her dignity, her autonomy, her very self. The silence that now permeated her home was a welcome balm, a canvas upon which she could finally repaint the life they had tried to erase. They called, but she didn't pick up. She had nothing left to say to them. The quiet hum of her newly reclaimed home became a canvas for introspection. As days turned into weeks, and the last vestiges of Michael and Sarah's presence faded, Eleanor found herself in a period of profound reflection. The initial surge of triumphant defiance had settled into a more contemplative peace, allowing her to truly process the seismic shifts in her life. She looked back at the decades she had poured into Michael, the endless sacrifices, the unwavering devotion, and a stark, painful truth began to emerge. She had raised a man who knew only how to take, but never how to give. He had consumed her, resources, her emotional energy, her very identity, with an almost childlike entitlement, always expecting more, never offering reciprocity. The narrative he and Sarah had spun, that she was old, fragile, a burden, now seemed a cruel, self-serving distortion. It wasn't she who was the burden, it was them. They had burdened her with their greed, their ingratitude, and their casual cruelty. This realization, though painful, was also incredibly liberating. With this clarity came a resurgence of self, a rediscovery of the woman she had been before Michael became her singular focus. The hobbies she had shelved for years, deemed frivolous in the face of her son's needs, slowly re-emerged. Her old watercolor set, dusty but intact, found its way back onto the easel. The vivid blues and greens she loved flowed onto the paper, a quiet act of defiance against the muted tones of her recent past. She sought out the local library, not just for new books, but for community. She joined a book club, tentative at first, but soon finding joy in the lively discussions and shared passions. The laughter in the room, genuine and unforced, was a stark contrast to the hollow echoes of the party she hadn't been invited to. And then there was her sister, Martha. Their bond had thinned over the years, stretched taut by Eleanor's overwhelming focus on Michael and Martha's quiet frustration with Eleanor's unwavering self-sacrifice. Now, with a hesitant phone call, the connection began to mend. Long, rambling conversations filled the void, tales of shared childhood, forgotten inside, jokes, and the quiet comfort of unconditional love. Martha listened without judgment as Eleanor recounted her ordeal, offering not pity, but solidarity and understanding. Reconnecting with Martha was like finding a piece of herself she hadn't realized was missing. The emotion she felt wasn't a jubilant, explosive joy. It was something deeper, more profound, freedom. It was the quiet, steady breath of autonomy, the gentle hum of living for herself, by her own rules, for the first time in what felt like forever. There was a lightness to her step, a clear-headedness that had been absent for too long. The silence in the house was no longer isolating. It was a sanctuary, a space where she could think, create, and simply be. In a symbolic act of reclaiming her space and her life, Eleanor arranged for the locks on every door to be replaced. The old, worn brass gave way to shining new mechanisms, a physical representation of her newfound security and control. And then she set about transforming the guest room, the very room where she had been imprisoned, where she had overheard their chilling plans. With deliberate brush strokes, she painted the walls her favorite color, a warm, calming shade of lavender, the scent of fresh paint replacing the lingering memories of humiliation. It was no longer a guest room, a place of temporary exile. It was simply another beautiful, vibrant part of her home, a testament to her resilience, and a vibrant declaration that she was finally truly free. The kitchen, once a stage for silent humiliation, then a battlefield for reclamation, was now simply a kitchen again. The morning sun, a familiar golden cascade, filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, just as it had for decades. But today, the light felt different. It was soft, welcoming, infused with a sense of peace that had been absent for far too long. The long oak table, where countless family meals had been shared, where she'd celebrated milestones and comforted heartbreaks, was now set just for her. A single, delicate teacup rested on a saucer, a plate with a simple piece of toast beside it. In the center, a small vase held a sprig of fresh lavender from her garden, its gentle fragrance perfuming the air. There were no champagne flutes, no echoes of forced laughter, no tension hanging heavy in the space. Eleanor moved with a quiet grace, a woman no longer burdened by resentment or the weight of expectation. She boiled water in the familiar kettle, its gentle whistle a soothing sound in the silence. As she poured the amber liquid into her teacup, a faint steam curled upwards, carrying the comforting aroma of her favorite Earl Grey. She stirred in a spoonful of honey. Watching it dissolve, a small, everyday ritual made profound by its newfound solitude. She settled into her chair, the same chair she'd sat in countless times, but this time there was no phantom presence across from her, no judgmental gaze, no subtle dismissal. The silence was absolute, unbroken except for the soft clink of the spoon against the porcelain, the quiet rustle of her dress as she shifted, and it was glorious. This silence wasn't the suffocating quiet of isolation, but the expansive quiet of freedom. It was the silence of a mind at rest, a spirit unburdened. She savored each sip of her tea, letting its warmth spread through her, tasting not just the bitter notes of the brew, but the sweet essence of her hard-won autonomy. Her gaze drifted around the room, taking in the familiar details that were now truly, unequivocally hers again. The chipped paint on the windowsill, the slight tilt of the portrait of her late husband on the wall, the worn patch on the rug near the stove, each imperfection a testament to a life lived, a home endured and reclaimed. There was no one to please, no one to impress, no one to hide from. The air was clear, clean, unpolluted by the toxicity of others' desires. This simple act, eating breakfast alone at her own table, felt like a monumental achievement. It was a tangible manifestation of her victory, not just in court, but within herself. The battle had been long, the wounds deep, but she had emerged, not unscathed, but whole. She had faced her deepest fears and found strength she never knew she possessed. She had chosen herself, when those who should have cherished her had chosen only their own gain. They say family is everything, her thoughts echoed, a quiet voice inside her head, clear as the morning light. But sometimes you've got to choose yourself, especially when they never did. The sun climbed higher, bathing the kitchen in an even brighter glow. Eleanor finished her tea, placed the cup gently on the saucer, and rose from the table. Alone, yes, but undeniably, gloriously free.